Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, An Introduction to World Language Assessment. Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. After we introduce ourselves, we'll go over the basics of assessment before we discuss the core principles of language assessment and some best practices for assessment design and administration. We'll wrap up with a summary of what we covered today, and we'll share some next steps for you at the end. So to begin with some quick introductions. My name is Leslie Fink. I'm a senior research assistant at the Center for Applied Linguistics.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jillian Seitz. I'm a research intern with the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center. We are also joined today by our colleague, Jamie, from the Center for Applied Linguistics, and today she'll be monitoring the chat.
And please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. And feel free to add a little information about your teaching context, such as the ages or grade levels of your students and the languages you teach. While you're telling us about yourselves in the chat, I'll quickly introduce our organizations. The Center for Applied Linguistics, or CAL, is a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C., and we were founded in 1959. Our mission is to promote language learning and cultural understanding by serving as a trusted source for research, resources, and policy analysis. We work on a variety of different projects related to language and education. This webinar is also presented by the AELRC, the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center, which is a Title VI language resource center collaboratively led by researchers at Georgetown University, Cal, and ACTFL. The center's mission is to facilitate useful assessment and evaluation practices that help foreign language educators innovate and improve their programs, ensure accountability to students and society, and articulate the value of foreign language studies in the world today. Now that we've all been introduced, let's talk about the purpose of today's webinar. The webinar today is focused on providing you with a basic introduction to concepts related to world language assessment. By the end of today's webinar, you'll be able to define language assessment and performance assessment, understand the 4 principles of assessment: validity, reliability, practicality, and impact, and describe best practices for designing tasks and evaluating task performances. Now I'll turn it over to Jillian to cover some of the basics of language assessment.
Thank you, Leslie. So I'm going to kick off this webinar by, as Leslie said, covering some of the basics of language assessment. For our webinar today, we're going to adopt a really broad understanding of assessment. When we use the term assessment, we're referring to the ongoing measurement of a person's language knowledge or skills in order to gather the information needed to make inferences and decisions about that person's language abilities. Assessment can allow teachers and students to monitor students' language growth over time, learn about students' language abilities at a certain point, and make decisions about what to do next. And it can also enhance, empower, and celebrate students' language learning. Language assessment is a very, very powerful tool in the language classroom. It can let teachers know if instruction has been effective and give them the confidence to move on to the next unit. It also allows students to understand if they are meeting the expectations and goals set for them by their teachers and programs. Language assessment can also empower students through self-assessment practices and allow individuals to track language proficiency gains. It can measure learning outcomes at the end of a course of study and also really effectively encourage reflective teaching and learning practices. When it's utilized as evidence for program evaluations, assessment can provide support for programs or even bring about needed improvements. And like we'll discuss in a little bit more detail in just a moment, language assessment can create opportunities for assessment performance tasks. Do any other purposes for assessment come to mind? Please feel free to share your thoughts in the Zoom chat. Before we go on, let's consider some different kinds of classroom-based assessments that exist. We use the term formative assessment to refer to assessments used throughout the course of instruction to provide feedback on learner progress towards goals. Formative assessments are often used to plan for future instruction. We call them formative assessments because they inform instruction. Formative assessments may look like calling on a student to check their understanding of a newly introduced piece of knowledge. You may also conduct formative assessments by reviewing ungraded exit tickets at the end of the class period. Lastly, a really common form of formative assessment that teachers may not even realize they do is to just listen in on student interactions during group work. Are they understanding what's being asked of them? Are they comfortable using the target language with a peer? Another type of assessment is referred to as summative assessment. Summative assessment is frequently what we think of first when we hear the term assessment. Summative assessments provide feedback to the instructor and the learner about the learner's achievement. This could be the achievement of a specific course goal or achievement of specific language proficiency gains. Summative assessments are frequently involved in some decision-making processes, such as assigning grades or even approving learners to move on to the next level. They may also be used to inform program evaluations and keep language programs accountable to their goals. We call these assessments summative because they summarize learner language ability. Summative assessments often occur toward the end of a learning period. This could be a short vocabulary quiz at the end of the week. It could also be higher stakes, like an end-of-unit project or a one-on-one oral proficiency interview at the end of the school year. Now let's discuss how we can go about assessing world languages. One type of assessment that's really effective for world language teaching is performance assessment. We will be focusing on performance assessment for the rest of this webinar. This type of assessment requires students to use language in real-life situations for real-world purposes, thus demanding that students develop an understanding of how the language is used in real life. It's based on performing with language rather than demonstrating passive knowledge or understanding of the language. Typically, performance assessments involve one or more of the three communicative modes. Interpretive communication, which involves one-way communication where the learner is receiving information. It can be interpersonal communication, which involves two-way communication between two individuals. Or presentational communication, where the learner is engaged in one-way communication and is the one transmitting a message. This type of language assessment helps teachers and students understand how well students are meeting specific objectives and provides information on their authentic language abilities. As Sandrock says, it may also empower your students because they will know how well they can perform when actual communication is needed. Think about every time you might have been nervous about saying something, so you line up every word perfectly in your head. But then when it comes time to speak, you still freeze. Performance assessments really help students to develop confidence that they do actually know how to communicate, even when they are put on the spot in real-world situations. Here are some examples of performance tasks. They don't provide any information on appropriate proficiency level, but they should give you an idea of the form that performance assessments frequently take. For interpretive communication, you might supply students with the task of listening to a podcast and identifying certain pieces of information from the content. For interpersonal communication, you might prompt your students to talk to one another about a gift to bring a host family on study abroad. Finally, for presentational communication, students may be tasked with creating a poster to inform the public about an event. As you can see, these prompts ask students to complete a given task. You, as their teacher, can assess how they complete that task. If you use performance assessment in your classroom, please share any tasks that you use in the chat. They can be almost inspirational for other teachers. Let us take a moment now to go over some characteristics of really good performance tasks. Performance tasks will be based on the needs, which are determined by your course objectives and the resources that you have available to you. They're going to be authentic, both in terms of reflecting real-world activities and being authentic to your students' individual lived experiences. The tasks need to make sense to your students. They are contextualized, meaning students have access to all the information they need to perform accordingly, especially if the task requires an imaginative element. So if we take that example I presented earlier with the students talking about gifts to bring to host family during study abroad, all of your students should be able to complete the task, whether or not they are planning to pursue a study abroad experience. The tasks must also be appropriate for students in terms of proficiency level, as well as grade and age level. Asking students to perform a task that is beyond their level can have a negative effect on your students' motivation, and it can provide inaccurate or incomplete information about students' abilities. Finally, good performance tasks have clear standards, meaning you know what a successful performance looks like, and you have some established criteria of a successful performance. These expectations and standards, we usually recommend sharing them with students as well, so that they know what they're supposed to do and what your expectations are for them. Now that we've introduced these basics for world language assessment, please take a moment to think about how you currently assess students in your program. What types of assessments do you use? What is working well, and what could be improved? We're going to move into the next section of this presentation, but these reflection questions are in the chat in case you want to continue to think about them as we move forward. Now that we've covered the basics, let's move into the core principles of assessment and demonstrate how they can apply in classroom contexts. In the following slides, we're going to describe each of the 4 principles of assessment. They are validity, reliability, practicality, and impact. Although all 4 principles are important to consider when developing or adapting an assessment, it is better to understand each principle as a scale. Some assessments will inherently be more valid than others, and other assessments may be more practical. What is most important is that you approach assessment design by thinking about how to balance all of these principles at once. As we move through the 4 principles, consider how they might work together and how they might be at odds with one another. This will help you understand your priorities when you move to design your own assessments. So, what is validity? When we say that an assessment is valid, we mean that the assessment is measuring what it is supposed to measure and is being used for the right purpose. This also means that the decisions we make based on test results are appropriate. How you measure validity will change depending on the context of your assessment. The most important question to ask yourself when checking for validity is, does my assessment actually measure what I want to measure? To determine this, we'll think about the following. You can consider who your students are and other details like their proficiency levels, their strengths, even their weaknesses. You also want to think specifically about what you want to measure. What are the activities and content that you've already covered in class? What are the most important elements for students to take away from that content? Then you can consider why you want to measure that particular skill or knowledge. How is it going to benefit your students? And especially, how is it going to benefit your students in using the language in real life? Finally, a really important question to consider from the get-go is, how will you use the results? Are your students going to understand the connection between classroom learning and the assessment? And will your results match the focus of this instruction? Let's take a look at an example of validity in context. I'll read this example out loud so you can follow along. This is Enrique. He says, Sorry, one moment. This is Enrique. He says, I teach Spanish in an elementary school to grades 1 through 3. None of the students come into the program with any previous knowledge of Spanish. After our unit on shapes and colors, I play a game with the students to assess whether or not they have learned this vocabulary. It's an achievement assessment. I find objects of various shapes and colors in my classroom. Then I say the shape and color of a certain object, and a student has to bring the object to me. Next, that student calls out a shape and color, and another student brings the object to her. The assessment continues until all students have participated. This shows me whether or not the students have learned the shape and color vocabulary. In this scenario, we can see that Enrique's assessment is measuring what he wants to measure: his students' vocabulary knowledge of shapes and colors. We can also see that the assessment reflects real-life language use based on what we know about the age of his students. They're first through third graders. Finally, the scenario shows us that Enrique's assessment is consistent with instruction since he has just finished a classroom unit on shapes and colors. These 3 points help us to understand how Enrique's assessment highlights some validity considerations. Once you engage with all of these questions and begin designing your assessment, you will want to follow these best practices for validity. It's very important that your goals and objectives for assessment are clearly defined. Consider the specific evidence that you need and why you need it. And importantly, what do your students need to know or do? This will allow you to continuously tie your assessment back to your learning objectives, which will support its validity. It's also important to contextualize your assessment with what you know about your students and the environment, including your classroom, school, and community. This will help you make informed decisions about how prompts are delivered, the content that informs test items, and the environment your students are tested in, as well as other important factors. Crucially, however you assess your students, you want to make sure that the tools you use will provide you with sufficient information for the decisions that you make based on the results. If you follow any other best practices for ensuring your assessment's validity, please feel free to share your knowledge in the chat. The next principle of assessment is reliability. Reliability refers to the consistency of the results of an assessment. For example, if the same students were to take the same test twice, would they get the same results? Will the assessment yield similar, comparable results from students of the same ability level? And if 2 evaluators were reviewing the same performance, would they rate the performance the same way? How you consider reliability, like validity, will also be very context dependent. You will be seeking to answer the question, does my assessment provide consistent results? To answer this question, you should consider if the results match what you know already about your students' abilities. You can also think about if your students agree with the results based on what they know about their proficiency levels and skills. Another good test of reliability is checking to see if different test items produce the same results when they are testing the same skill. Finally, it's important that all of the assessment raters come up with the same results when evaluating the same performance. We call this inter-rater reliability. Will there be consistency among the raters or evaluators? Something that has to do with materials when it comes to this last point is that having a clear scoring process or rubric can really determine the reliability of your assessment. Are your raters or evaluators or yourself provided with objective tools to measure performance? You may have started to sense that there is a strong relationship between validity and reliability. It's important to remember that you cannot have validity without reliability. Here is how we can visualize this. Imagine a dartboard. The center represents what we want to measure. If you have high reliability, then all the results will end up in the same area, but low validity would make them far from the center. The assessment may be reliable, we know where the darts will land, but it's not really measuring what we want it to measure. On the other hand, if you have low validity and low reliability, the results are going to end up all over the board. You are never going to be able to predict where your learners might land because there's no reliability. But when reliability and validity work together, we know that we will have accurate results. Let's take a look at an example of reliability in context. This is Locke. He says, I teach Chinese at a high school program that emphasizes writing. I administer writing assessments to my students halfway through the program. This year, the program coordinator has asked me to use a rubric that she developed for rating writing assessments. When using the rubric, however, I realized that I was rating differently for the first few assignments that I reviewed when comparing these to the last few assignments that I reviewed. As you can tell by hearing Locke's scenario, his rating system is producing inconsistencies, making his assessment less reliable. Here are some ideas that we came up with for helping Locke with the reliability of his assessment. Firstly, he could update or revise the rubric that was given to him by the program coordinator in order to better match the content of the assessment that he administered. He could also take more breaks during his rating sessions. Reliability can really be impacted by fatigue during rating. And lastly, he could opt to read all of the submissions first to calibrate his expectations before beginning to rate the assessments. Before we move on, let's review some best practices for ensuring that your assessments are reliable. First and foremost, a thorough review of test items for clarity and validity is important for your reliability. Additionally, the clarity of instructions and prompts will inform the reliability of your assessment. A student should not be prevented from showing their knowledge based on a misunderstanding of the instructions. This would be a reliability concern. It is also best practice to familiarize students with the format of a test beforehand so that student performance is not negatively impacted by the effort that it takes to understand what to do. Another important consideration to have is if you're using any sort of technology, you really want to be sure that the equipment you plan to use actually works. This usually involves checking the equipment multiple times during the week leading up to a test, and also on the day that you are delivering the test. Finally, when it comes to evaluating the results of a test or performance assessment, using a strong rubric with clearly and objectively defined criteria will make the results much more reliable. We're going to talk more about rubrics at the end of this webinar. Please feel free to share any of your own reliability practices in the chat. Practicality is the third principle of assessment. Practicality refers to the feasibility of an assessment given the resources available to you. You will want to think about the time that is available to you for designing the assessment, preparing your learners, administering the assessment, and rating the assessment. You'll also want to think about the money that any of those steps require, either for your time, other people's time, or the materials that you need. You also want to consider the expertise that is required to design and rate certain assessments. Will that have a really long time cost if you're having to build up your own expertise in that? Lastly, you'll want to think about the personnel that are required. If you want to do one-on-one oral proficiency interviews with students in the hallway, who is going to watch the rest of the class in the meantime? The primary question to ask yourself when considering practicality in assessment design is the following. What resources and limitations does my assessment have? You might answer this question by thinking about the amount of time you have, both for administering the assessment and scoring it. You'll also want to think about how much funding you have, the labor costs of who needs to be there to administer the assessment, and any materials that you have to purchase for it. You'll also want to think about how many students are going to participate in the assessment. Will they work in groups, as pairs, or individually? And are there going to be any student accommodations to prepare for? How many instructors are going to be needed for administration and scoring? Are they going to require special training to do so? That's also something you want to prepare for. And lastly, what are the materials that you need? Will your students need papers or pencils? Will you need to print the test ahead of time or prepare the rubrics? And importantly nowadays, is the assessment going to be administered online or in person? Will you need to make sure that your students have Wi-Fi access or headphones? This is all very important for practicalities. So let's look at another example, this time of practicality in context. This is David. He says, I teach Hebrew to beginning elementary students. I want to assess my students' oral proficiency at the end of the program using face-to-face interviews. I have 45 students, so I'm a bit concerned about time. However, there are some student teachers who can help administer the assessments. And classroom management isn't an issue because the rest of the class can be working on independent activities. I have recording equipment to help me gather information from the assessment and a small budget to cover testing expenses. In this example, with 45 students, David has to figure out how to assess oral proficiency with a limited amount of time available to him. David managed the time concerns in multiple ways. Firstly, he had enlisted student teachers who could administer the assessment such that multiple students could be assessed at one time. He also created independent activities for students to work on during class time while they were not undergoing the assessment. Finally, he opted to use some recording equipment that is available to him so that he can actually rate the assessment performances at a later date. All of these steps help to make an oral proficiency assessment more practical for David's larger class. In order to address all of these practicality considerations, here are some best practices that we suggest. Firstly, it can be really helpful to utilize an assessment format that you are familiar with. Trying to learn a new way of assessing as you are doing it can add a lot of time and pressure to your work. You also want to think about what kind of assessment conditions work best for you and your students. For example, you may determine that it is just more practical to deliver the directions in English rather than the target language, or to provide students with additional supports to accomplish a task. If they are contextually driven decisions, these can be really good considerations to make. Finally, like reliability, assessing the technology you plan to use is critical. You may have a very valid assessment prepared, but if it requires technology that doesn't work, it's going to be entirely impractical. We won't get a chance to dive in too deeply to scoring practices today, but I do just want to mention that depending on your assessment purposes, it may be important to weigh the pros and cons of a holistic or an analytic scoring approach. A holistic approach allows you to give one overall score, while an analytic approach will give individual scores for different aspects of performance. This can be a consideration if you're assessing the practicality of a given scoring approach. If any other best practices for practicality have come to mind, please share them in the chat for others to read. The final principle of assessment is impact. Impact refers to the overall effect of using a particular assessment and the relationship between assessment and instruction. A related concept is washback. This can be divided into positive and negative washback, which impacts a student, teacher, program, or larger society. Positive washback refers to the helpful or desired effects of an assessment, whereas negative washback is the harmful or unwanted effects of assessment. Something that you want to ask yourself is, what are the consequences for stakeholders? First, let's clarify the term stakeholders. With assessment, stakeholders refers to any individual or group that is interested in your program or course, or will be affected by it in some way. For example, your students, test developers, and administrators are all stakeholders of your course because these groups may be directly involved in and interested in the course's results. However, other groups may be considered stakeholders, even if they are not directly involved in the assessment. Stakeholders for assessments may include the students who undergo the assessment. Will they feel as though the assessment is connected to their needs and interests? It may also include the instructors. Will they be given valuable information as a result of this assessment? Thinking even more broadly, it might include the administrators, especially if the results of the assessment could have an impact on the program as a whole. It could impact families. They may be interested in assessment results, or they may even be involved in helping their students prepare for the assessment. Finally, we can think about assessment impact even more broadly. How could it affect the community? Will it help your students be more engaged community members in the short or long term? Let's take a look at an example of impact in context. This is Merdad. He says, I teach Persian to university level students. My students want to be sure that they are prepared for jobs requiring proficiency in Persian after graduation. For this reason, I want to institute an end of program oral proficiency test. I am also required to administer additional end of program assessments to support program evaluation efforts within my department. And I have to coordinate with my colleagues when planning for and administering assessments during this busy time of year. It can be time-consuming to complete all of these assessments, but I know that the information gathered will help both me and my students in the future. First, let's think about the stakeholders that Merdad has to keep in mind while preparing his assessment. Merdad has to think about his students' interest in the language and their goals for language study. He must also consider the needs of his colleagues for his department's ongoing evaluation efforts. Additionally, because the assessments are used for evaluation efforts, he has to think about how the assessments might impact program administration in the future. And finally, he must also consider himself as a stakeholder when thinking about the utility of the information collected through these assessment procedures. Now, let's think about some potential assessment impacts for these stakeholders. Firstly, for those students who are looking to use Persian in their careers, this oral proficiency assessment will provide them with information about their language abilities before they undergo higher stakes assessments for their careers. Additionally, Merdad will provide information to this department about student performances for the department evaluation. This may lead to decisions being made about the appropriateness or effectiveness of the assessment or larger teaching practices. Lastly, his decisions about when and where to conduct the assessment may have an impact on his teaching plans as well as his colleagues' teaching plans for their own assessments. Now that we've analyzed Merdad's situation, let's go through some best practices for handling all of those impact considerations. Firstly, we recommend adopting a backward design model. It's helpful to start with your learning objectives and ask how you can assess those. Then you want to build your assessments and instruction around those objectives. You also want to define what successful task completion looks like and make sure that your students are familiar with that as well. What is sometimes missed is a full consideration of all possible stakeholders. Like we said earlier, this can even involve families and community members. It's important to consult with key stakeholders as well. If you are conducting an assessment that is part of a larger evaluation project, consulting with your department leaders or administrators can be a really important part of the process. Finally, perhaps the most valuable practice to take away when you're considering assessment impact is observing the effects of assessments before and after administration. If any other practices having to do with assessment come to mind, we encourage you to share them in the chat. We have now covered the 4 principles of assessment: validity, reliability, practicality, and impact. Before I hand things back over to Leslie, I want to prompt you to reflect on some of your current practices. Based on what you know now, how valid, reliable, and practical are your assessments? What do you think could be improved? And what do you know about the impact that your assessments currently have? How might you go about increasing positive washback and limiting negative washback? I'm going to let Leslie continue with our presentation, but these questions are going to be in the chat for you to continue to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian. Jillian gave us some great considerations for the principles of assessment that will be in the background as we are developing different tasks. But what does that look like when it comes time to actually write your task? That's what we'll dive into in this section for both developing tasks and evaluating task performances. In order to start designing your own performance assessments, you can start by asking, what do I want to know? Importantly, what is the learning objective that you want to assess? This might be phrased as students will be able to do something. When determining these learning outcomes, you'll want to be sure that they're addressing the proficiency level of your students and the communicative mode that you're interested in. If you'd like more information about aligning learning outcomes with proficiency levels, ACTFL's can-do statements can be a useful resource. They're a list of statements that describe what students can do at different proficiency levels, and we'll put a link to those in the chat. Once you have in mind the can-do, the learning objective that you want to know more about, you can think more specifically about what you want to know about your students' knowledge and abilities. This will allow you to be sure that you're measuring what you want to measure, which will strengthen the validity of your assessment. Next, you'll want to brainstorm how to assess student progress towards your selected learning objective. Considering real-world scenarios that your students will engage in is another great way to tie your assessment to validity. Thinking about how students will actually demonstrate their skills will also allow you to address the practicality of the assessment. What resources will they need to undergo the assessment? What resources will you need to assess their performance? Those resources will likely involve a method of evaluation, such as a checklist or a rubric, which requires you to have a strong understanding of your expectation. This will determine what successful task completion will look like and enhance the reliability of your assessment. You will also need to plan out your task administration method. Will students receive written instructions, or will you explain the instructions out loud? What about the prompts? Make sure to also think about any materials that students may need to complete the task, and all of this will inform the practicality of your assessment. Before administering any tasks, it's important to consider how they relate to the other assessments planned for your course. Will students be familiar with the format? Will it include content that you've recently introduced in class? And how does this task compare to what you are preparing students for? Contextualizing the assessment task within your larger program primes you to think about assessment impact. Finally, designing a task also involves considering the impact after the assessment is administered and evaluated. It's important to have a clear idea of what you and others will do with the assessment results. Will you be in a situation like Merdad, who we heard about a moment ago, who had his own uses for the assessment results, but the results would also be used to inform a program evaluation? You also want to be sure to think about the impact of results on students. Will they receive feedback that empowers them to continue their language study and know what they need to work on and improve? Or will they get a grade and no feedback and be discouraged because they don't know what it means? If you would like some inspiration for creating real-world scenarios, you could consider using the SCRAP model. This prompts you to imagine a situation or location to set up for your students and then decide on a challenge that they must overcome through language. It will also get you to think about their role in the situation as well as the audience of the language that they create. Finally, you may think about the product that is created in the end. So the example we have here is perhaps your school has an upcoming international night and you would like to encourage members of the community to attend, members of the community who speak the language that you teach. In this scenario, the situation is the upcoming international night. The challenge is encouraging those community members to attend and reaching out to them. The student's role is to be the marketing committee for the event. The community is the audience, and the products will be whatever it is that students create to encourage attendance. Those recruitment materials such as posters, messages from the school, local radio announcements. Your imagination is the limit. We also received a question in the chat earlier about vocabulary. And of course, we don't often have situations in life where we have to fill out a vocabulary worksheet, but some similar situations that are performance assessments would be things like filling out a form at the doctor's office where we might say, oh, here's my vocabulary of my head hurts, my shoulder hurts, those sorts of things that would use the vocabulary in a more authentic situation, or perhaps navigating an online shopping situation where you might select from a few different options. When you are designing assessment tasks, it can be useful to incorporate visual supports as well as various cues to make sure your students understand the prompts. As Jillian talked about earlier, this helps ensure that you are measuring what you want to measure, students' performance on the task, and not whether they understand the instructions. So generally, the instructions will be at a slightly lower proficiency level than what you're trying to measure for your students to ensure that the focus remains on the task itself. As part of designing learning tasks, you also want to think about how you will evaluate task performances. Think about why you are conducting the assessment. Is it to assess students' strengths and where areas of improvement exist? Is it to check understanding? What you want to know will be a key component of any evaluation method you pursue. You also want to consider who this information will be shared with. We do recommend sharing evaluation materials with students so that they're aware of your expectations. So that can look like sharing the rubric along with the assignment instructions. But when you do so, you want to make sure that the language used is student-friendly. So this means making sure descriptions of language quality emphasize what can be done with the language rather than what can't be done, as well as being clear and easy for students to follow. And the same advice is true if you work with younger learners and you may not be sharing the materials with the students themselves. You might be sharing that information with parents or families. Generally, since assessment tasks are open-ended, using a checklist or rubric is best. These kinds of tools allow you to be sure that the subjective evaluation process remains consistent and fair by comparing student performances to pre-established criteria, which is important for validity and reliability. For this section, we will talk about two main types of evaluation tools, checklists and rubrics. And when you are choosing which one, you may want to think about the following considerations. One is, what are the resources, such as the time and materials you have to create the tool and use it in your classroom or program? Checklists tend to be a bit easier and faster to construct and use. Do you want a tool that students can use for self and or peer assessment? Checklists may be easier and more effective for this type of assessment because they are yes, no. Is the characteristic there or not? Whereas rubrics, as I will get to in a moment, measure quality. So if you are trying to measure the quality of a performance, rubrics would be the choice for you. You may also think about how much information you need to provide about improving performance. Since rubrics provide more detailed information, they can help students understand what to focus on if they want to improve. If you opt to create a checklist, you can start by listing the aspects of performance that you want to evaluate. Then you want to decide who will be using the checklist. You, your students for self-assessment, a teacher's assistant, a student teacher. Depending on who is using it, you may think about how you phrase your criteria so that the checklist is clear and easy to use. Checklists also tend to be useful for keeping track of non-negotiables in assessment, such as sticking to a time limit, or as we see in our example here, naming 2 sports in this particular activity. So as you can see in this example, there are 2 categories, yes or no, for each of the criteria. When it comes to creating a rubric, you'll start similarly by thinking about what you want to evaluate, but you will likely be a bit more specific about the specific criteria that you would like to include in the rubric. So some examples there are things like task completion, the quantity of language that is used, the quality of language, and so on. Then you will choose the levels of the rubric. So 3, 4, or 5-point scales are common, and that's what we can see here across the top. Those are the different levels, which sometimes get a name such as approaches expectations, meets expectations, and exceeds expectations. Then you will create your chart with the criteria and the levels, and you will fill in the boxes with descriptions of the performance at that level for that criterion. So as you can see in this example, it can be helpful to use similar language and structures so that you can see the differences between each level, and it should progress relatively smoothly so that it's a steady progression from that lower level, mid-level, and highest level. One final step for rubric creation that is perhaps the most critical is actually testing out the rubric before using it in a high-stakes environment. So that can look like piloting with a subset of students or taking some old papers or assessment tasks and practicing using the rubric on those to see if it's working well for you. You can also discuss the rubric with your colleagues and ask for their input. Rubrics can be complex, so it can be helpful to get another set of eyes on them. Now that we've discussed designing and evaluating tasks at a high level, here are some questions for you to reflect on. How do you currently design tasks? What has been working well for you, and what could be improved? How do you currently evaluate task performances? What has been working well for you, and what could be improved? And those questions will be in the chat so that you can continue to reflect as we move forward. Now let's take a moment to summarize what we've discussed today. Today, we introduced some basic concepts related to assessment in the World Language Classroom. Now that you have completed this webinar, you can define language assessment and performance assessment, understand the 4 principles of assessment: validity, reliability, practicality, and impact, and describe best practices for designing and evaluating task performances. Now that you have more information about assessment, I want to ask you a few final reflection questions. Feel free to share your answers in the chat as we wrap up, or simply reflect or jot down the answers for yourself. Our questions are: what is the most useful thing you've learned today? How can you apply what you have learned today to improve your assessment practices? And what do you still want to learn more about? If you are interested in learning more about assessment, we will put some links in the chat to more free resources like this webinar. First, this webinar is part of a series hosted by Cal and the AELRC. We highly recommend you visit our YouTube page to review past webinars, which include topics like oral proficiency assessment and rubrics in the World Language Classroom. We'll put a link to the channel in the chat, and that is also where this recording will be posted soon. Second, we recommend that you take a look at sample tasks and tools for evaluating performance that your colleagues are using and that you can find publicly available from other teachers and organizations. One organization that has some examples is CARLA, the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition at the University of Minnesota. And there are other organizations that post examples for you to view. Finally, Cal and the AELRC frequently host professional development opportunities, so we encourage you to keep an eye out for future events. On behalf of Cal and the AELRC, we are so grateful for your attention and engagement in today's webinar. If you have any questions for your facilitators today, please feel free to email us. Our emails are on the slide, and we will paste them into the Zoom chat as well. And if you would like to learn more about the work of Cal and the AELRC, we have those QR codes on the screen for our websites. Thank you so much for attending, and we wish you a great rest of your day.